on Zoom, obviously today and tonight. We will have a teaching session tonight, and we will start our lessons on Paul David Tripp's book, What Did You Expect? We will begin to talk about marriage. If you don't have this book, that's okay, because what we're going to be doing in this lesson is we're not necessarily looking at chapter 1 of this book. We're going to be looking at marriage in general from the scriptures. What is marriage? What does it point forward to? And be looking at several biblical texts. So we are going to start that tonight. It will start at 6 o'clock, regular time. And as far as Zoom meetings go, we will continue to do this week and next week. The following Sunday after that, we will potentially meet. So we're doing this for 2 weeks. Standard recommendation from CDC and all that. So we're just going to do a 2-week thing. Sunday nights are still a go. Wednesday nights are put on pause. We're not going to meet this Wednesday. Or I'm sorry, we're not going to do a lesson this Wednesday. We'll do a prayer meeting like we did before. However, let's see, what time does prayer meeting start? It starts usually at 5:30?
6:30.
6:30. Okay, yeah, we'll do that. We'll be 6:30 meeting on Wednesday. And we'll just do a prayer meeting, share prayer requests, pray for each other, and then that will be it like we've done before. But we will not do a lesson. I might read the text, but that's about it. There's a couple comments, but that's about it. So we'll meet tonight, we'll meet Wednesday, but we're not doing a lesson Wednesday. We'll do this for 2 weeks, and then I will update you next Wednesday of what we're going to do with the following Sunday. Does that sound okay? Okay, I got the thumbs up. All right then, let's go ahead and get started with Hebrews chapter 10 through starting in verse 32 down through 12, verse 6. Now that's a large section of scripture. I'm not going to read all that for the public reading, but I'm going to read a selection of verses from this. So I'm going to actually read for this text chapter 11, starting in verse 32 to the end of the chapter. And that's going to set us up, I think, for what I want to talk about this morning. Obviously, we know this chapter. It talks a lot about faith. But I want to present this in a way that perhaps some of us have not seen before. Okay? And I'm going to tie it into the book of Revelation. And you'll see how we tie it into the book of Revelation in a minute. But it's important to see the text, okay? So let's go ahead and read, though, chapter 11, starting in verse 32. I'm going to make some notes about what people of faith are like. And then I'm going to make up the main note at the end of why this chapter is there. Why chapter 11, that great chapter in the book of Hebrews, why is it even there? Why did he put it there? And why is it located in its particular place? So let's go ahead and read the verses. It says, "And what more shall I say? For time would fail to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, and of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection. Some were tortured, refusing to accept release, so that they might rise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned. They were sawn in two. They were killed with the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, and mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. And all these, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us, they should not be made perfect. Well, let's pray. Lord, I do thank you for this text, and I pray that you would illumine it to us and open our eyes to your light. In Jesus' name, amen. So a little bit of background I think is important. The book of Hebrews was written to a group of Christians, probably Jewish Christians, who had been suffering persecution. The persecution was not yet to the point in which they were being killed. That's really important. Some may have been killed, but most of the Christians probably hadn't been slaughtered at this point in the church. And these Jewish believers, you can see this in chapter 10, starting in verse 32. It says, recall the former days when you were enlightened, you endured a hard struggle with sufferings. It says, sometimes being publicly exposed to reproach and affliction, and sometimes being partnered with those so treated. Okay? So they're being publicly exposed, they're being reproached. You had compassion on those they were being thrown in prison, right? Compassion on those who were in prison. You joyfully accepted the plundering of your property, since you knew that you yourselves had a better possession and an abiding one. In this context, this is what you're seeing. You're seeing they've been mocked, they've been imprisoned, they've been afflicted, their property has been plundered. They joyfully accepted all of this because they knew that they had a better possession. But it seems, if you flip over to chapter 12, verse 4, it says, in your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. So this is giving us a context of the church. Here we have people who have become Christians, their property is being plundered, they're being thrown into prison, stuff's being taken away, they're being afflicted, but they're not shedding their blood. Okay, so they're not being, skinned alive or put on stakes like they did in the time of Nero and so on and so forth. At least these guys were. So, that gives us a little bit of context. It's a pressured church, but it's not yet a bleeding church. Okay? We know that that's going to happen. All right. Typically, what would happen in this time is, let's say Walter was preaching the gospel on the street and he was thrown into prison. And let's pretend just for a moment that everyone in Sardis heard that Walter was thrown into prison. And let's say that Brandon and Sam heard about it, and they wanted to go with Michael and Michaela to prison to give some things to Walter. Because the prison guards knew that Walter was a Christian, they would kind of maybe not give him the necessities of life, like bread. Okay? They'd give him moldy bread or something like that. They would kind of hurt him in prison. What Brandon and Sam and Michael and Michaela are doing is they're going to the prison to help him, taking bread with them and visiting him. But let's say that when they did that, when they came back home, they would find that their property had been plundered, that there was graffiti and stuff painted all over the walls of their house. Brandon's shop had been broken into and just ransacked. Someone had gone to the hood that he was painting and sprayed it with paint remover. It would be just a terrible situation, right? You see where I'm going with it. Yeah, that was impromptu. It was very good. I appreciate the laughter there. But you see what I'm saying. What they would do is because you went to show love to someone who was a believer, they would go back to your house and plunder your property. Okay? This type of stuff was happening. And the way that they received it was, when they originally became Christians, they joyfully accepted it, because when they went home, they said, you know what, that's not really my home. My home is with Christ. My home is in the heavens. Not a big deal. It would be like them going to an apartment, finding it ransacked, and then say, well, this isn't my home. I don't have a lot of stock invested here. So, I mean, it stinks, but that's okay. I'm going to be going home shortly anyway. This is the way the church originally reacted. However, the book of Hebrews is addressed to these struggling Christians, and they're not joyfully accepting that persecution anymore because it's getting amped up. And some of them are saying, hey, you know what? And when we were with Judaism and stuff like that, we didn't have to endure persecution the way we're enduring it now. And I'm thinking maybe we should go back. Some of them are contemplating leaving the faith. And so the author of Hebrews is addressing this group of Christians who have one hand on the handle and one foot out the door, and they're being persecuted, and they're thinking of going back to Judaism because of persecution. Is everyone kind of following with that? Like, yeah? Okay, all right. And so he writes this section of his epistle to them, and he talks about great people of faith. So the first thing I want to do is this. You know this chapter. You know Hebrews chapter 11. It's filled with Abel and Abraham and Isaac and Moses, Noah, and all the rest. And he's going over and over and over again, just talking about how great these people are, like we did with John Bunyan. I want to make some notes real quick about the list of people that he gives in chapter 11. So here's the first thing I want to say. People of faith, like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and all the rest, they please God. That's point number one. People of faith please God. Where do we get this? We get it in chapter 11, verse 6. Without faith, it is impossible to please him. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. You cannot please God if you're a non-believer in anything that you do, in any good act. Whatever is not done by faith is sin. So if you're not walking by faith, it is sin. It is sin. But the people who are of faith, who approach God through faith, they do please God. This is very important, because in the Old Testament, who can ascend the mountain of the Lord? Who can ascend the hill of the Lord, if you will? It's only people of faith. These are the ones that please God. The second thing that we notice about people of faith in chapter 11 is this. People of faith are exiles and pilgrims. Look at verse 10. This is speaking of Abraham. He, that's Abraham, was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. Jump down to the end of verse 13. They were strangers and exiles on the earth. So they're walking around, strangers, exiles. Their home does not belong here. They don't invest everything here. If everything is plundered, if all their property is plundered, they say, they believe fully, this is not my home. I'm not worried about it. My home is in the heavens. And notice at the end of verse 16, this is God's reaction to them. This is really great, by the way. Notice this is the word therefore. It says, but as it is, they desire a better country, that is a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God. That's an interesting phrase. Think about that for a second. God is not ashamed to be called their God. So when they walk around and they say, God, Yahweh is my God, that's my God, God is like, that's right, and I'm proud of it. You see? He's not ashamed to be called their God, because he's been saying, you're right, I'm preparing a place for you, this is my home. Just as a side note, you know, we should invest, we should be more like that. We should invest more into our heavenly home than our earthly home, for sure. God is not ashamed to be called their God. Point number 3 about people of faith. This is still in chapter 11, looking at verse 25. People of faith value different things than the world does. People of faith value different things than the world. Verse 25, speaking of Moses, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God. Okay, so choosing, I want to align myself with the people who are persecuted rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. Verse 26, he, that is Moses, considered the reproach of Christ, and here's the phrase of value, right? Greater wealth. I don't know what your translation says, but greater wealth is good because this is what Moses is doing. He's saying, here's the reproach of Christ, and I'm analyzing it. I'm making a value statement. That's better than, it's greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt. For he was looking forward to the reward. Here's Moses standing there, and he's looking at all the wealth of Egypt. You remember Moses. He was like second to everybody in all of Egypt. All the treasures of Egypt. And he does a value estimation and judgment. Here's all of Egypt and all their wealth. And then here's the reproach of Christ. I'm going to go with the reproach of Christ because I know that the cost of following Christ, yes, is persecution. But the reward far outweighs the cost. And it far outweighs any treasure that I'm finding in Egypt. So he sees this, and this person of faith, Moses, values that greater than anything else in the world. If you look at any worldly man, any worldly person, that's the total opposite. They'll take all the treasures in the world over Christ any day of the week. Even like selling him out for 30 pieces of silver. Less than the treasures of the world. Let's just take 30 pieces of silver and we'll trade it. It's very easy to do that for the world. You understand? How about the anointing oil that went on the person's feet when it was the alabaster oil that was broken and poured out? Yeah, that's more wealth than Jesus for Judas. You see? Christians are not like that. People of faith are not like that. They say, no, the reproach of Christ is much more worth it because the reward is better. Point number 4, and this comes from the text that we read earlier. People of faith are tough, and they do great things. So the text that we read earlier about Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, and David, Samuel, and the prophets, did they do great things? Yes. They shut the mouths of lions. People received their dead back by resurrection. And you can just think of the story of the Old Testament, right? They put foreign enemies to flight. They made walls fall down around Jericho. Those are great things. Great things. But in order to do those great things, you had to be willing to suffer. And this is why I'm saying that they are tough and they do great things. Because they know that in the midst of doing great things, they're going to receive lots of persecution. And they were okay with it. Because it says here they were stoned, sawn in two. We think that was probably Isaiah, by the way. We think that it was like a blade that was at a very steep incline, very sharp. And they would take... we think the prophet Isaiah, church history tells us this, possibly that they dropped him on this blade, and by the time he got to the bottom, he was cut in half. Like, whoosh, he was cut in half. Something like that. Sawn in two, killed with the sword, went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, and mistreated. They're tough. They're very tough. And the world is not worthy of them. Wandering about in dens and mountains and caves of the earth and deserts and so on and so forth. So, that's not an exhaustive description of people of faith. But that's a good attempt. They're tough, they do great things, they value things different than people in the world. They're exiles, they're pilgrims, they please God. Now, why did the author of Hebrews do that? Why did he go into such a list? And this is why this last point that I want to make is the main point of the whole lesson. This is why I want you to have your Bible open in front of you so you can see what happens before the chapter and what happens after the chapter is over with, because it helps us understand the whole context. If you look at chapter 10, verse 39, just kind of look at that verse for a second. And when you're looking at that verse, remember what we said a second ago. We said this is a church that's pushed to the brink, right? Some people have one hand on the door about to leave. They're Jewish Christians. They've left Judaism. And then the author of Hebrews is coming in and he's calling them back. Stay in the church. Stay in the church. And then he says in verse 39, we are not of those who shrink back and are destroyed, but are of those who have faith and preserve their souls. He's setting up an argument here. He's saying, look, I'm encouraging you to endure. Here's why you should endure. Because you're part of different stock. You see? Your spiritual pedigree is filled with people who are tough. And you're not merely cut from some cheap, weak mold here. You're cut from Abraham's mold, Isaac's mold, Jacob's mold, Moses' mold. You see? Now, to get the kind of feel of this, let me tell you a little story real quick, okay? So I've said this before, maybe even to you guys, it's hard to remember. But when I was in Salt Lake City, I was working there for the summer, and they have a family history library where they have all this microfilm and stuff. And I went, because I knew that my uncle had told me that we think we're related to Robert E. Lee. And so I was like, well, I would really like to find that out for sure. So it's free. So when I was in Salt Lake, I went there and spent hours there. And I wanted to know what my lineage was. Well, come to find out, we go all the way back to the man who stood up in Congress, whose name was Richard Henry Lee. And he was the first to stand up in Congress and say, I make the motion that we should declare independence. He was the first to say that in Congress. So everyone's there. The Declaration of Independence was drafted because my ancestor stood up and said, we need to break. And that was a treasonous statement. Richard Henry Lee. From him came Robert E. Lee in one direction. We went in a different direction. It goes back even further than that. We're part of what's called the Lees of Virginia. Well, I'm very proud of that, you see. I mean, even telling you about that, I'm like, man, that's really great. We're from stock that is like of people who do daring and risky things because we know it's right type of thing. He was the second president pro tempore of the Continental Congress. Some of the land that we had went to George Washington, where Mount Vernon is now. They were good friends. When I hear about that, I'm like, there's something in me that's kind of like, man, I'm very proud of the name I bear because of the things that our ancestors, I want to live up to that to some degree, right? The author of Hebrews is doing the same thing. You have Jewish Christians, maybe not all Jewish, but many of them Jewish Christians. And he's saying to them, here's Abraham. And when a Jew would hear about Abraham, they would stop, they would listen. When they heard about Isaac, when they heard about Jacob, when they heard about Moses, when they heard about Noah, and they would go through the spiritual pedigree, they would have one hand on the door, and they would be hearing of their own pedigree, and they would be saying, man, those men were great. They did conquer kingdoms by faith. Abraham went, and he did suffer persecution for the cause of truth, and he followed his God. And he's wanting them to hear, chapter 10, verse 39, we aren't of those who shrink back and are destroyed, but we are of those who have faith and preserve their souls. They got one hand on the door handle. They got one foot out the door. They're hearing of Abraham, and he's screaming to them, saying, you are part of better stock. You're part of Abraham's stock. Now get back in here. We know this because if you look at the very end of the chapter, chapter 11, okay? This is why the context is important. In verse 39 of chapter 11, it says, and all these, that is Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, Barak, Jephthah, David, Samuel, the prophets, all of them, though commended through their faith, didn't receive what was promised, since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us, they should not be perfect. What does that mean? Okay, Abraham and all the rest have been carrying a spiritual baton, so to speak. And they're running that race that was laid before them, and with their dying breath, they drop it off to the next generation. And then that generation does it, and that generation does it, all the way up until Christ comes. And the author of Hebrews is saying, here you are, you got one hand on the handle, ready to lead the church, and Abraham and all the rest, with their dying breath, has carried the baton and they've dropped it into your hands. And you have the responsibility of completing that race. What are you going to do? Do you see the emotional appeal to the listeners in this book? Well, if I were in that situation, I would let go of the handle and I would come back into the church and I'd say, come what may, well, let's go forward and let's all go forward together. And that's exactly what he wants his people to do. Chapter 12, verse 1. Therefore. See how the argument is set up? Therefore. Okay, since we've done all this work, we're not of those who shrink back, we're of these guys. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witness, let's lay aside every weight and sin that clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. So he's calling them, based on all that huge argument that he's doing, he's saying, come back. Let's finish this race. Let's get rid of all the weight, that unnecessary weight, unnecessary sin, and let us, notice how it says it's us, let's all do this together, and let's endure, come what may. Now, for one thing, I hope that helps you understand why he put chapter 11. It's not merely a list. Okay? Anybody can just make a list and be done with it. It's a call. Okay? Saying, be like these guys. Now, what we've been doing as a church is we've been doing these short biographical sketches, right? John Bunyan, we didn't get to a lot of them. I wanted to cover William Wilberforce and Calvin and all that, but Athanasius, Augustine, these guys did the same thing. They carried the baton. And here we are, look at us, going through the book of Revelation. And what is a theme that keeps coming up? Persecution. It just keeps coming up. The Lord is preparing us as a church for something. And here we are. And now we have this text. This text should do the same for us as it did for them in this time. I think that more and more persecution will continue to happen within the church across the United States. And here's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to link arms together and say, what did you expect? Every one of our ancestors who's walked by faith were tough and did great things. They had to endure persecution. They valued things other than this world, right? They were exiles, they were pilgrims, they pleased God. So, when we're going through the book of Revelation, and we're thinking about persecution that is already here and is coming, what should we do? This should encourage us to press on and go forward. To link arms together, to remember that we're of the same exact stock. The baton is in our hands and we have to finish the race as well. Well, that concludes the lesson that I wanted to give you from Hebrews chapter 10, 11, and 12, mainly chapter 11. I hope it's been encouraging. Do you have any questions